I thought it would be useful to say something about myself because, sorry, you can't hear me. I have a slightly different talk than people have had so far. I have a background in medicine and history and philosophy of science. And then for the past several years, I've been working with Peter Gluckman's group that has come to evolutionary medicine from developmental origins of health and disease perspective. So,
move it up.
Okay. Should be okay? Okay. So I will be I'll be talking about the history of the relationship between evolution and medicine. And I was inspired actually by many statements, some statements that opened some of the programmatic papers about evolutionary medicine by Randy Nesse and others that have lamented the historical lack of medical interest in evolutionary biology. And they explained this by sort of historical fact that at the time of Abraham Flexner's report, so the time when basic science education was placed into the curricula of American medical schools, it was also the time of the crisis in evolutionary biology that historians of science call the eclipse of Darwinism. And that by the time evolutionary biology gained more explanatory power at the time of new synthesis, it actually was too late because these curricula were filled up and closed. So in my talk, actually, I want to engage a little bit with this idea that times of conceptual change and times of disciplinary change have something to do with interest in in evolution by medics and just closer ties between medicine and evolution. And so I will talk a little bit about, and I will look at the relationship between evolution and medicine over the last 100 and so years. Obviously, it will be some of these. The topics that I will be talking about have been published in this chapter that Peter Gluckman and I have published in Michael Bruce's book on Darwin and evolutionary thought. Now, medical historian Fabio Zampieri identified two periods of heightened interest in medics in evolution, or sort of a heightened exchange between evolutionary biology and medicine. The second one being now, and the first one being between 1880s and 1940s, the period that he termed medical Darwinism. And then very briefly, the medical Darwinism revolved around the concern that development of human society, in particular of medicine, social institution, welfare, removed the pressure of natural selection upon humans. So, thus allowing diseases to accumulate, in particular diseases that came to be known as diseases of civilization. And then the solution to this problem was really for medics and society to take natural selection into their own hands. And of course, the solution then leading out is to control reproduction. So what we know today as eugenics. And it was mentioned in a lecture yesterday. Now, at the same time, it's quite interesting that medics were interested in natural selection and the action of natural selection because, as I mentioned, natural selection was quite, the evolutionary biology was going through crisis in early 20th century in the sense that no one, 50 years after Darwin, no one doubted evolution, but most people questioned the usefulness of natural selection as the central or indeed relevant mechanism that natural selection that evolution needs to proceed, and they proposed all other kinds of alternatives, for instance, Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics, or orthogenetic proceeding of evolution just by a sort of innate source that drives evolution in the right direction. And finally, the new discipline of genetics, observing the phenotypic effect of mutations, proposing that basically evolution is the accumulation of many mutations. So what I'm sort of saying here that this is really an interesting period of heightened disciplinary change and paradigmatic change in thinking about heredity and source of variation. And eventually it will come out together with evolutionary biology at the time of new synthesis. But as I was mentioned, it was by that time there was somewhat less exchange between evolution, somewhat less interest of medics in evolution. Now, the idea that was there really a hiatus between 1940s and 1990s in exchange between medicine and evolution? Yes, perhaps medics were not publishing on evolutionary topics and mentioning evolution very much in medical journals, but that doesn't mean that there was no exchange and no contribution, especially from the side of evolutionary biology to medicine. And I've identified a few areas where there was a particularly strong exchange. One area was obviously coming from geneticists and theorists of evolutionary synthesis, new synthesis. So for instance, probably the most well-known example is the idea of balancing selection, when in 1949, J.B.S. Haldane discussed the example of the gene which, when homozygous, caused a severe disease, thalassemia major, and when heterozygous was actually provided, was also caused a mild form of anemia, but he argued at the same time offered conferred protection from parasites that were prevalent in the areas from which these people who were carriers of this gene were coming from. And of course, this idea of balancing selection, I mean, thalassemia major and sickle cell disease are relatively small, not everywhere, but a relatively small problem. But the idea of balancing selection captured the fancy of geneticists who try to explain many diseases that exist at constant level in population, yet at the same time are serious, and we would have possibly expected natural selection to deal with them. One interesting example was the proposal that schizophrenia is basically an outcome of, the persistence of schizophrenia in population is an outcome of balancing selection. And it was proposed by no one other but Julian Huxley and Ernst Mayr, together with two American psychiatrists. And they argued that schizophrenia was caused by a single partially dominant gene with low penetrance, so only about 1/4 of people would actually develop overt disease. And they sort of speculated that it must confer some sort of advantage, be it a reproductive advantage. So they talked about mothers being particularly emotionally attached to their children, or perhaps some advantage in resistance to certain forms of disease. And the sort of interest in this very speculative proposal that they received could be explained not just by the fame of Huxley and Mayr, but also by the fact that this supported biological psychiatry at the time when psychiatry was quite heavily dominated by psychoanalytic psychiatry. Now, probably the most long-lasting proposal was the one made by James Neal, an authority in American genetics, who gained fame initially by his work on the effects of radiation on the victims of nuclear bomb in Japan. And he was disillusioned with the value of mathematical models for the study of human evolution, and he proposed that we should go into the field and study natural selection on populations that he termed untouched by civilization. And by the early 1960s, he developed the idea that the rising epidemic of metabolic disease was caused by changing dietary patterns. Things that we actually talked about quite a bit yesterday. His argument that humans evolved in an environment of scarcity, food scarcity, heightened physical activity, and they were not really evolved to cope with the abundance of food and low physical activity we have today. Now, at the time, both of these were completely theoretical concepts, but as you know, much of the later work actually goes back to these proposals from 1960s. Another area that there was quite a bit of exchange is immunology and infectious disease, and we can term it in this as a kind of idea of disease ecology, a very loose disciplinary network that came together around infectious disease, response to disease, and evolution. And I mean, I just sort of mentioned here Frank, and put the name of Frank and picture of Frank McFarland Burnett, a famous immunologist whose theory of clonal selection rested on the theory of natural selection. So arguing that immunity relies on the selection and of multiplication of those lymphocytes, the receptor of which fitted with the antigen. And these, again, had to do with a heightened concern with human impact upon the environment, like from Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring onwards. And then around 1980, especially emergence of new infectious diseases and rising awareness of evolving resistance, something that people have been aware since 50s, but they become particularly aware then. And finally, particularly contentious area possibly is the psychiatry, where psychoanalytic psychiatrists took the work coming from ethology on imprinting and on evolutionary, or evolved on sort of evolutionary benefit, on evolutionary basis of mother-child bond, and took it into psychoanalytic psychiatry. I've sort of put here probably the most famous is John Bowlby's attachment theory that still is much used, and Harry Harlow's work. I don't really have time to go into detail, but and I looking at sort of why this really happened. And I said that I want to talk about a bit social and disciplinary background. Is certainly the need of psychiatric community to forge stronger links with science, and also, of course, there was an evolutionary argument for putting women who were working in Second World War in factories and offices into home environment. Now, we come to 1991 and the dawn of Darwinian medicine, and certainly it has nothing to do with medical Darwinism of the early 20th century. But the kind of, we've seen over the last 25 years that there's been quite an expansion of interest. We now have a society, there's an institute, and as a historian, I'm quite interested in, why. And I don't have, and sort of the thing that have quite interested me is that, and sort of something that parallel that I could see with early 20th century is that we again live in a period of possibly quite interesting conceptual change in evolutionary biology, something that we only very briefly touched in some of the lectures. For instance, ever since the publication of Human Genome, there's been a failure of large US studies, we've noticed, to actually explain much of the phenotypically observed heredity with genes. And so there have been many calls to try to find other sort of solutions, say, in particular with epigenetics. And that kind of fits well with ideas coming from developmental, evo-devo and development studies that are calling for more concern and more input of developmental concepts, in particular developmental bias, developmental plasticity, needs construction of this variation that's pretty much non-random, and to integrate it better with the evolutionary synthesis. And it will kind of be, as a historian, for me, it's interesting to see how much as medical, here working on evolutionary medicine, how much do we take part in this current ongoing debate, and how this may change actually what we're doing in evolutionary medicine. Thank you.